Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. I'm Wai Leong, and I'm from Hedge Advisors Clerical, and I'll be your moderator for today. We will be recording the session for the benefit of those who can't join us today. So if you know of someone who is interested but can't join us, let them know that there's a recording that they can also watch after the session. Before I get John and Liz to share their insights for the session, allow me to frame the discussion that we'll have today. We started off the year knowing that it is the year of elections. We headed into the year anticipating some change. We knew that we have to navigate some level of uncertainty along with the change. And I think for some of us who are more optimistic, we are hoping that the change will be for the better. We are now in October. Elections have taken place in key markets like the UK and EU. The question on everyone's mind is, what do the outcomes mean for clients and companies around the world? Equally important, the US elections is 4 weeks away from us, and the race is currently too close to call. I have John from Hedge Advisors Cicero and Liz from Hedge Advisors Abernathy with us today to share a little bit more on the outcomes of the elections that have taken place, as well as the upcoming US elections. Maybe we'll start and indulge me in allowing me to start with the first question. John and Liz, what can you tell us about the results and the elections that have taken place so far? Is there any interesting insights that you can share with us on the results?
I'll jump in first there, Wei Long. I think it's difficult to shoehorn such a diverse set of election results into a common narrative. You see slightly different numbers, but we've had something like 64 countries voting in democratic processes this year. It's something like 2 billion people or more. Some people say that half of the world's population lives in countries that has voted this year. So to come up with a sort of common narrative around that's quite challenging. But one thing I think I would be comfortable in saying is that it has been a year that's shown that it's hard to be politically hegemonic. If you look at South Africa, the ANC had its most challenging set of results. Narendra Modi and the BJP didn't do quite as well as they'd expected. And then if you look at what's going on in Europe, the centre is sort of holding, the mainstream is holding to a degree, but you've got this increasing challenge from parties of the left and the right, which are chipping away at this sort of long-standing establishment that sort of occupied European politics. So if you take the UK general election, I'm in London. Yes, Labour did win big, but what we saw was really quite extraordinary growth in smaller parties and the vote shares that they're taking. Again, in France, an election we didn't even think was going to happen at the beginning of the year, there was a result there that showed that the National Rally was a serious threat to the mainstream. So I think it's hard. It's hard to run a political party. It's hard to stay in power. Voters are probably more volatile than they have been in the past. And it's definitely a time where smaller parties seem to be challenging increasingly larger parties.
Thanks, John. Liz, what do you found interesting about the results of the elections that have taken place so far?
Yeah, I have to agree with John here. I'd say that I think it's going to take a while for us to really understand what those trends are. I mean, consider that over the last 10 years, we saw a rise in populism and authoritarianism as well, but we really didn't see those trends and piece them together as a society and understand what they meant for quite a while after they happened. Trump, Brexit, autocrats who were elected, this rise of, you could say, populism, you could also say nationalism, that really has taken hold over those last 10 years. I think what's stunning to me right now is to John's point about the elections that have been held so far in different parts of the world, there really is a lack of consistency in outcome. And what I would say is that, across the board, in just about every region of the world, political parties are changing. So what we think about, John, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because I'm going to say it too, but the mainstream may not be the mainstream anymore in a lot of regions of the country. Frankly, in the US, that's what we're going through as well right now. I'm based in Washington, and the Republican Party of today is in no shape, way, or form the Republican Party of yesteryear. And if Donald Trump wins again, that he will continue to foment his view of what republicanism, conservatism is. If he loses, the Republican Party is going to have a real soul-searching moment. And yet I have not heard anyone say that we're going to go back to the traditional establishment. I will say what these results have shown so far, though, if there is consistency, it's in, to John's point, voter angst and anxiety and concern. And keep in mind, voters are consumers. They're employees of companies. They are the foundation in many ways of our economy, our global economy. And so the pressures on them are real, and they're voting with those pressures in mind. So it's the economy, it's rising prices, it's the supply chain issues that are causing rising prices across the world. For some, it is human rights. For others, and many, one of the consistencies is the effect of climate change and extreme weather. We're going through this in the US right now with more hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, threatening even more disruption. So the pressure on voters, and then how voters are casting their ballots with those pressures in mind, that is the consistency that we're seeing right now. And I think in the next few years, we'll understand more about what other trends may be showing up this year.
Thanks, John, Liz. Before we go on further, for those who are joining us, you can actually drop your questions in the Q&A chat box that you can find on your panel. We will be opening up to Q&A questions after we have addressed some of the common concerns or questions that people might have in their minds. So I'll encourage everyone to drop their questions and we'll get onto them. Okay, back to the topic of interest, right? John, Liz, I'm hearing some commonalities on what you have shared, right? We are expecting more volatility, and that's being driven by concern and anxiety. And I know John is saying that, it's very hard to generalize the results of the election so far because every country has their own set of issues and challenges to face, right? But we are seeing across the board globally that there will be more volatility because of these concerns. From a company point of view, are we expecting more frequent shocks for their businesses? Is that what they can expect?
So luckily, we did some research on this earlier in the year, and H Advisors commissioned a piece of research, which is global elections through the eyes of international business leaders. And what we did was we interviewed 111 C-suite senior leaders in global firms, actually fairly evenly geographically distributed across the world. And we asked them about how they were looking at this year of elections. And that was quite a challenging thing to do because this year the target constantly moved. We had elections where we knew they were going to happen and when they were going to happen, but in the US, the candidate changed halfway through the process. Or we knew there was going to be a UK general election that just happened several months earlier than most people were expecting it to happen. The French election wasn't expected at all. So it was a really fascinating piece of work to do simply because in front of our eyes, the sort of situation kept changing. But one of the things that was really striking about the results is that there's a sort of sang-froid amongst business about political volatility now. And I think this goes back to what Liz was saying earlier on, that we've kind of gone through 10 years of political upsets now, things that people didn't really expect. So business now is better prepared, I would say, than ever for volatility and unexpected results. I mean, we also interviewed people as well as doing a quant study. But one of the things that one of the respondents said was, look, this is the world that we live in. We have to deal with the world as we find it. So we do more scenario planning. We will prepare for various outcomes. We won't just go, well, we think that's 80% likely and not worry about the 20%. There's much more focus on political tail risk now, and particularly in Western democracies where, traditionally political risk analysis was something that you sort of thought about in certain, parts of the world, but not in the Western world. I think that mindset has completely been put to bed. So I think business leaders are relatively relaxed, but that's only because I think they're much more invested in doing the prep and planning for different outcomes from electoral events.
Yeah, they learned their lesson, right? From I think 2016. And that was the real shock to the system. I think if you look right now, there's so much, you could dismiss it as noise, but it's noise with real world implications. So expanding wars in the Middle East, Ukraine and Russia, and I would add, China sitting on the sidelines or getting involved behind the scenes in a lot of different geopolitical issues, but the threat of a rising China, or the opportunity, depending on where you sit in the world. You have pirates in the Suez Canal that have been shutting down ports left and right at times, all that, rising gas prices, the implications of gas prices, the implications, of more conflicts around, it's easy to dismiss some of the stuff as just noise. And I think some of the counsel that at times we give are just block out the noise, right? You can't block out the noise when there's actual business implications, the effect on the supply chain, the effect on employees. In a lot of these places, we have multinational clients who have interests in all of these regions and need help in navigating through those. So yeah, I guess to a certain extent, let's block out the noise, but also understand where the noise has a real impact on the business and be ready to pivot quickly. Focus on what you can control. I think businesses really need to think about what is noise and what is an impact on the business, certainly if it's a material impact, of course. And to John's point, scenario plan. And then I think the piece, and you have to plan for every outcome in every scenario, and even the unknown, which can be a little difficult. I think the other piece that is probably the most critical to positioning yourself if you're a company, and certainly if you're a multinational company, is making sure you're not choosing sides. So getting to know all the potential players early. For a lot of this, it's late in the game, right? Elections have been decided across the world, but don't just get to know the people who won and the party in power. Get to know the opposition too, because as we've seen over the last 10 years, things can change very, very, very quickly.
Liz, you talk about the noise and being able to filter through the noise to know what exactly matters, right? A lot have been said and written about the upcoming US elections. So from your point of view, what's noise and what should we really be focusing on?
Well, first of all, ignore the polls. I mean, I think the consistency across the polls is that remains a very tight election. I think that this race is being waged on rhetoric alone. There's a lot of noise out there, but that doesn't mean that we don't understand what the policy positions of Vice President Harris and former President Trump are, and perhaps will be. It's important to factor in and think about that it is very possible that there could be dividing power. So a different political party could win the White House than wins Congress, and that will shape the policy agenda. In some campaigns, there are breadcrumbs that are left about what candidates would do. Here we have entire records. We not only have, a first term of former President Trump to draw on to really understand what he did and how he has turned his rhetoric into policy over time. But we also have a real sense of what he will do, in part because of his rhetoric, but even more so because of the policies that he's and his team have really pushed to amplify what they would do in the first term, or what they did, how they would carry on and amplify what they did in the first term. Vice President Harris is in a very different position. She has a record as a former candidate for president, and has a long history of being an elected official. So there's a strong record there. In the last 4 years, she has been the vice president and has moderated some of her positions. But given this shorter campaign, keep in mind she only joined the campaign when President Biden stepped aside just a few short weeks ago. And her team has specifically declined to put what I think of as meat on the bones or any details around any of her policy positions. And that was strategically by design so that she wouldn't generate even more criticism from her opponents and give voters too many details so that they won't be, so they could be turned off. So all of that is to say that this is a campaign of rhetoric. And I would say that a lot of it is noise and a lot of it is sound bites that are intended to generate support among very narrow pieces of the electorate and the voting base. Because this is a tight election. It will continue to be a tight election, and any little change in a voting pattern can make a difference and can secure a victory. So a lot of it's noise, but I would encourage everyone to look underneath the hood a little bit and really understand what is real and what is just made for TV, reality show, which is a lot of what's going on right now.
What do you think, John? Speaking from the perspective of businesses, how do you think they're watching the US elections? And especially when the race is too close to call right now, do you think that they're nervous about what's going to come in 4 weeks' time?
I don't think nervous is the right way of describing it. And again, when we go back to the survey results, I think we asked people what do you think about a Trump victory? What do you think back then about a Biden victory? And one of the more striking responses we got was from a pretty senior executive in a US tech firm. And he said, these candidates are bad in different ways. And I think that's probably the way that a lot of businesses are looking at it, is they're seeing upsides and downsides in both of the candidates, but I don't think they would say either of them would be an unmitigated positive for them. And that's not a political thing. That's just them saying, well, for example, a Trump administration may have risks for certain things, and a Harris administration might say, well, we're going to regulate in a more European style, for example. So I think that's the message that came through from the survey that we did.
I think it's also important to note that because of this rhetorical war that these candidates are in, let's not get lost from the fact that Trump will govern primarily and this is a broad scope, but general Republican conservative orthodoxy. Harris will govern generally in liberal democratic orthodoxy. They are both at times moving to the center, mindful to reach those narrow slices of independent voters who are going to decide this election state by state, but also because they're bowing to the reality that they could see divided government and they may have to govern from the center. But how does that relate to companies? Companies can start to, if they haven't already, prepare for each side of the political spectrum. This is not, neither one of these folks are going to govern as a moderate unless they absolutely have to because of divided government. And so, John, to your point about them feeling a little more comfortable, no matter who gets in office, and being a little more prepared, that's part of the reason why we get lost, I think, sometimes in what I think of as the bomb throwing, the rhetorical bomb throwing in a campaign, instead of stepping back and looking at the big picture and saying, oh, this is actually a very similar choice to what we see every 4 years, if you're a company.
The other thing I just add, Waylong, is that just viewing it from this side of the Atlantic, typically by this point in the US electoral cycle or the campaign cycle, there's very, very strong coverage of that race in European outlets. we're somewhat unusual this year because there have been lots of other electoral events going on. So lots of other countries have had changes of government or changes of administration, which has somewhat taken the attention away from the US. And we also have a hot war going on in the Middle East. So there is a very busy news agenda, which I think is somewhat taking international attention away from the US race. I think it will come back onto the US as we get into the final weeks, but I must admit, I'm pretty struck that we're not really reading as much about the US race as we would, and maybe that's Liz because it is so hyper focused on such narrow interests in the US, which maybe don't resonate as much, and we're not really reading or hearing as much about where, for example, Trump or Harris stand on foreign policy, which you would have expected to have seen a much bigger role, a much bigger role of that in the campaign at this point. So,
well, particularly John, with two
massive
wars going on, right, and other pressures around the world. I think where you'll start to see it is if Harris writes off, a state like Minnesota, or a state like Wisconsin, which has, Minnesota in particular has huge Arab American interest, and the left flank of the Democratic Party is pretty upset with her about her views, or I should say the far left, on the war in the Middle East. You're starting to see her lean out more in those spaces. She's doing a series of interviews, mostly with soft, I would say, programs, with the exception of 60 Minutes, which she just happened overnight, where she is getting pressed on some of these foreign policy issues. And I do think that, though, that, these candidates are reading the voters, and the voters say the economy, the domestic economy, which is important, is by far their overriding concern, even though inflation has cooled, even though the number of jobs has increased so considerably that analysts were surprised on Friday when they got the jobs report. But then the other two issues that are quickly followed that are also domestic: immigration and abortion. And so this is, unlike I think other years, it's pretty astounding when you think about it, that we have significant wars going on, and yet the focus here is the backyard politics right now. But I do agree, John, that things could change in 4 weeks. I mean, we talk about October surprises. I sort of feel like this year it's been not an October surprise, an entire calendar surprise, because I feel like every week there's something else. And I think that's an important concept as companies consider, planning for the outcome. This can go any which way. Yeah. The voting pool of undecided voters is very, very small. Anything can tip the balance. And there's still, even though 4 weeks doesn't feel like it, there's still a lot of time on the clock. So companies would be wise to sit tight, plan best you can, and not get caught up in the whiplash of the final month of the campaign.
I think it's a very interesting point that John and Liz, you brought up, right? It's like how domestic issues have dominated the US elections, but there is a drawback to that, right? I think coming from Asia Pacific, one of the things that we are concerned about is how the US having to focus now on the conflict in the Middle East, as well as the Russian-Ukraine conflict. The pivot to Asia is now possibly being delayed again, right? This vacuum and what it means for Asia Pacific, I think it's something that's on top of a lot of our minds as well, right? Which then brings me to a bigger question is, after November, depending on the outcome, as well as the rest of the elections that have happened around the world, what are some of the big universal issues that company still be expecting or will still be shaping the environment? Will the conflict continue to go on? Market competition, scrutiny, where are we headed with all these?
So when we asked this question of businesses, like, what are you really focused on this year, 2024, and through the prism of the elections, what do you think the elections are most going to impact? There were three things that came out very strongly. Firstly is the economy, or financial stability more specifically. Like what implications will these elections have for the global economy and the financial stability of individual countries, which is not totally surprising. Okay, that's pretty obvious one. The second one was tech regulation, what it will mean for the regulation of emergent technologies, because almost any business of scale is now thinking about how these technologies might be applied to either improve their products or boost process efficiency or process data, you name it. And the third thing was the impact on sustainability. And Liz has talked about extreme weather in the Gulf of Mexico. This is now like we're seeing historically strong storms happen 2 times within a week. It's that kind of thing going on. And I think that's one of the areas where the result of the US election will have a very significant impact, right? A Trump administration and a Harris administration look very different on that particular issue. So to what extent are parts of the world moving in a different place on things like ESG to the United States? But I would say looking forward, there are some universals, but there are also distinctive responses depending on where you are in the world. Okay, so we asked people in Europe, what are you most concerned about? Economic growth. Like Europe's got sluggish economic growth, low productivity growth. That's a problem, and that's what people in Europe are worried about. Ask US businesses, what are you worried about? China. China is top of mind in the US. It's not in Europe, interestingly. You ask people in Asia Pacific, what are you worried about? Trade disruption. So Wei Long, that's the kind of that was the pivot thing that you're talking about. How does Asia sit between these rival superpowers? If you ask people in the UK, for example, what are you worried about? Supply chain disruption. And that's because they're still thinking about the long tail of COVID and of Brexit being on an island and how that impacts the ability to get stuff in and out of the country. So there are definitely things that are concerning global business collectively, but there are also distinctive responses depending on where you are in the world as well.
The only thing I'd add, I think John nailed it with, the concerns about technology, climate, economic insecurity. The competition scrutiny is real, and it is regional, and it's in just about every region right now, where regulators are looking hard, particularly in tech, but not exclusively in tech, about how to break up companies or protect market competition. And those issues travel from region to region. So, for example, the EU is much further along than the US in scrutinizing potential deals. And even when there's no deal on the table, scrutinizing existing companies and saying, hey, we've got a problem here. The US tends to follow a bit more, but has been very aggressive in the Biden administration on taking companies to task and scrutinizing mergers and acquisitions. That's going to continue. Yeah. What's been stunning to me is that has become a bipartisan issue, where you used to, in the US, and I would say overseas as well, see that come more from the left, that type of scrutiny. When it comes to technology in particular, the scrutiny is now bipartisan, in part because regulators and policymakers are hearing from their constituents who are concerned about the impact of technological innovation on their children, on their workers, on potential jobs in the future and what that looks like. And so that, to me, is probably the one, I'm not going to say the single biggest, but a very, very significant element heading into next year that I think that companies, I don't want to say brace for, they should be bracing for, they should be planning for it. Yeah. How are they going to adjust their approach to growing and to growth, which is really what M&A is about, at a time of increased bipartisan scrutiny in every region of the world?
It's such a good point. I mean, it was one of the things that came through very strongly from the research, that you've got, politics, we'll scenario plan for politics. Things change. It's volatile. The world is different to the way it was 20 years ago. But regulation is a real headache. I mean, competition scrutiny is part of it, but the level of regulatory fragmentation globally is a major concern, and the fact that you're being asked to do sometimes quite conflicting things in the US versus Europe, and then Asia has a very different outlook on some of this. So, if everybody's talking about global competitiveness, what does that actually mean? If you've got frontier technologies, for example, the European Union has gone in hard and early on AI, and does that create a benefit for the EU, or does it just mean that there's going to be less investment in the EU in those technologies? And we don't know at this point, but that absolutely is a major concern for business. Not just how am I going to be regulated in any given jurisdiction, but how do all those regulations interlock and impact on each other?
And impact business, right? It's been interesting to me to watch as some governments are, implementing regulations. It's fundamentally changing the business. Was it Apple that now has to have consistent power cords and power outlets because of a change at the EU level and a regulation of it? So this has actual impact on business and impact for consumers. The last thing I'll add to this list of universals is I can't understate the impact of these wars on bread and butter corporate issues, supply chain, supply routes, gas prices, employees, customers. At a time when the pendulum has swung back a bit from customers and employees demanding that their companies share the same values with them, but it hasn't swung all the way back. And so companies are still going to have to navigate how they handle these wars from a bottom line business perspective and also from a communications perspective, if they have stakeholders who are demanding that they weigh in at pivotal moments.
I want to return to the point on populism and concerns on constituents driving the competition scrutiny that we see around the world, right? And I think John mentioned that one way to prepare for that is always to scenario plan. And I think that would help to anticipate what might come your way. But speaking of beyond scenario planning itself, are actions going to make any difference? And if so, what kind of actions can companies take beyond scenario planning? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this seems very elementary, but I think the single greatest thing that companies can do to prepare in a moment of uncertainty is understand who they are and what they value. And that starts with reviewing the mission statement, reviewing your core values and purpose and your belief system, and making sure that you have the right people around you to help guide you through these uncertain times. And then trust those people and their counsel. I think sometimes when you're in a company, it's easy to think that the sun rises and sets on just you and your company, and you can get blinders on about how your company fits in the bigger societal changes and whether or not you do have to adapt and adjust and be nimble, or whether you can sort of ride the wave. Yeah. You have to understand not only the macro societal changes, but also your company's place in it and where you sit as a company within those changes. And if you understand who you are as a company and what you value, and then you also understand the bigger picture and compare those two things together, you're in a much better place to then scenario plan and then figure out what the right outcome is for you as you move forward. The final thing I'll say is companies can sometimes act in two directions. Either you have, one decider who's the CEO, or you have a multitude of people wanting to weigh in and no deciders. You need to find that middle ground. You need to have a very small group of leadership individuals who gather feedback and really understand what all stakeholders are thinking about a certain issue, the elections, any political issue or policy issue out there, and then have a process so that that team can get the information they need and then make the right decision going forward. Oftentimes that gets lost in the noise. John, sorry, I cut you off at there, I think.
No, nothing to add to that.
All right. Thanks, John, Liz. We've got a question from the audience. How will social media and misinformation impact public opinion during this US election cycle? And given the controversies around the last election, what measures are being taken to ensure election security and public trust in the results?
That's a great question. So I will start and I will say that misinformation is rampant. Look no further than the hurricane that's bearing down in the Florida Gulf Coast right now, where public officials of all stripes, Republicans and Democrats, are saying there's too much misinformation out here. Here are the facts. Part of that misinformation is being peddled by former President Trump's campaign about the level of assistance that the Biden administration and Kamala Harris have provided or will be providing Florida. So the threat of misinformation is coming from, in some cases, the candidates and campaigns themselves. In other cases, we know for a fact that there are foreign actors who are already putting misinformation out there and have been. This has been going on again for 10 years, at least 10 years, where you have foreign actors who are creating false Facebook posts and Instagram and TikTok posts in order to shape the election. I will say that the companies themselves, in many cases, have put together misinformation efforts internally to try to limit that. However, they've also many of them have also made a point that this is not their role, that misinformation, it almost seems like it's happening and there's not much they can do to control it. So they're kind of playing both sides of the fence here. But, I wish I could say that there are a lot of measures being taken to ensure trust and accountability in the outcome of the election results. But unfortunately, I think that this is just the reality in which our U.S. elections are operating. And there's really not much that can be done at this late point, 4 weeks out, to really limit misinformation other than make people aware that efforts to undermine the democratic, free and fair elections in the U.S. continue through misinformation channels.
I think there is an extension to that question too, right? I think besides misinformation, what has been observed are echo chambers being created. Yeah. And it's a deadly combination of misinformation and echo chambers being formed that resulted in this climate of mistrust. We've talked a lot about echo chambers. Do you think that has gotten worse, or are more chambers being created in today's context?
I can only speak from personal experience. I think it does get worse. The power of algorithms to shape the content that you see is based on, kind of funneling you in towards certain things. And I think this is, if I think on X, for example, how the content that I have seen over the last few weeks has changed just on certain subjects that I've shown interest in, and suddenly what you see is the diet that you're consuming is changing. And I think this is where, you've got this role, the question of the role of traditional media, right? So that was always what decided what was newsworthy, what you saw, because they controlled, I guess, that access to information. Now you've got this other source of information. Does I think traditional media have this opportunity to try and become a trusted arbiter of truth again, or is that battle completely lost? And we had this with actually Will Lewis spoke at the Nature Advisors event in Washington DC earlier this year. He's running the Washington Post now, and this is kind of the battle that they're fighting, is to try and show that they are the trusted outlet, that they will do the work and work out what's real and what's not, and serve that up to their customers using new technology. Or is it all just unmediated? Is it just a kind of unfiltered flow of information from a variety of sources, some of which could be foreign governments or foreign intelligence agencies deep fakes, which are very difficult to actually discern from the real thing now. It's a tremendously challenging time.
Yeah, and I would agree that it's getting worse. And what it's doing is eroding an overall trust in institutions across the board. So, 20 years ago when I was a journalist, I was writing about the loss of faith in institutions consistently, in particular, the loss of faith in government and Congress, as well as the loss of faith in companies. That's only gotten worse in the last 10 years or 20 years, where the people trust institutions in the US, that's all I can speak to, far less than they ever did, in part because of the misinformation campaigns that have been out there. It's really telling that among the most trusted, and they're still not very trusted, is companies. Companies are the most one of the most trusted. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. Companies were seen as the least trusted, and now the trust level among government is it's at bottom barrel levels. And so the only option then, when you think about it, is companies. Now, does that put the burden on companies to play a bigger role in terms of corporate citizenship and being good corporate partners? I think that may be the issue that companies are going to be wrestling with in the coming years, is what role do they play and what is their responsibility to society at large?
Speaking of trust in institutions, we got a question asking, are polls as unreliable in other elections as they are in the UK and some states? What are your thoughts on that?
So that interesting to look at the UK example. The outcome was predicted, but actually the polls didn't really get the vote shares that accurate again this time. I think polling people's really hard, and it's become harder to get accurate polls. Online methodologies are obviously used a lot more now. I think that probably makes it harder to get a representative sample, but they're just, I'm not a pollster. There just seems to be a difference between what people tell pollsters and what they actually do. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing. If you've got a poll that's saying 38, 39, 40% of the public are going to vote for Labour, and actually 32% of them do in the outturn, that's a big gap. And I can't speak for whether that's the same issue in the US, Liz, but you're talking about much finer margins.
Yes, I mean, very, very, very small margins. And I guess what I would say is that voters actually telling pollsters what they truly think and which way they're really going to vote has always been a problem. I think it's become amplified when the candidates themselves are not traditional. And so voters are hesitant, I think, in many cases, to say, yes, I support so-and-so, or no, I don't support somebody, if that person is polarizing or wildly non-traditional. And I think that's where the Trump factor kind of plays in.
We got more questions on the US elections. I think that's what a lot of people are interested in. So someone is asking, friends and colleagues in Europe have told me that they believe the US presidential election is existential for Europe. In other words, they worry that a Trump victory will have a profound and negative impact on the post-World War II order, namely on NATO and the EU. Do you agree? And if so, what are the implications for Europe and the world if US support for NATO and the EU were to weaken and perhaps end?
I'll take this one. It's an easy one.
Thank you.
We've already seen 4 years of Donald Trump. Like, his views on this are pretty well known. So I understand the apprehensiveness in Europe towards a Trump administration again, but his criticisms are partly well-founded, which is, you guys need to pay more for your defense. And since the NATO summit in which was it 2018, European countries are finally beginning to pay more for their defense. So if the complaint is that Europe needs the US to stand on its own 2 feet, well, that's a challenge for Europe, not for the United States of America. And but this shouldn't come as a shock, right? So 2016, it's now 2025, nearly 2025. This is 10 years Europe has had to grapple with this problem of what happens if the US isn't the partner that it used to be. And so if the concern is in 2024, 25 that that's still the case, then what was going on in the last decade or so? I think that's the fundamental challenge that Europe needs to grapple with, and I include the United Kingdom within that.
We got another question also on the US elections, but I think this question is quite interesting because while we are looking at 2024, this person is already looking at 2028. Question
there are a
is,
lot of potential candidates in the US, as a matter of fact.
question is, will the next election in 2028 be a repeat of the same ideas and ideologies we are seeing now, or will there be a bigger reset in the US society and politics after either a Harris or Trump presidency?
So I think what we have seen from history is that both major political parties have moved further and further to the right and left, have become more liberal and more conservative in general, as the years go by. I struggle to see how that changes going forward. I think it would take something existential in the US for either of those major political parties to really moderate themselves and come back towards the center. And the reason for that is in large part because of how we elect members of Congress and how their districts are drawn. Both political parties have created districts that are stock filled with their supporters. So what happens is the power in Congress is decided by a very narrow number of congressional races. And that has created an environment that is where you have to be highly partisan to win, which means moving further to the right and further to the left. Mm-hmm. Short of something monumental happening or a change in that system where districts are created that are more even with different types of voters, it's hard for me to see that any candidates will move towards the middle in 2028 or beyond. I think we are in a highly partisan, highly polarized, not just time, but electorate. So it would take something incredibly significant, monumental for that to change in 2028 and beyond.
Interesting. So partisanship is the answer here. We have another question, and again on the US elections. What would a Harris administration mean for the continued financial support for clean energy technologies? How central would it be to her domestic economic agenda? Coming from a UK perspective, Biden's Inflation Reduction Act had a significant impact on capital flows, and the new UK government is very focused on bringing in private capital to deliver its net agenda. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, John, let me take the first part and you can take the second. Okay. So I think this is a really fascinating question. And I spent 5.5 years in the energy industry with a multinational oil and gas and alternative energy company. And what's interesting about the lot that Harris would inherit is that the US has become the world's #1 producer of oil and gas. That is much, much different than where we were even 4 years ago. And then when you add to that fact that we have the war in Ukraine and we have the war in the Middle East, the expanding war in the Middle East, putting pressure on the global energy market and gas prices, and causing Americans to really understand the impact of focusing solely on climate change versus focusing on what we call here in the States the all of the above energy strategy, which is the notion that you're going to need oil and gas as well as alternative energies for the foreseeable future. It is hard for me to see that the Harris administration would act differently than the Biden administration, which has straddled support for increased oil and gas production in the US with financial support for clean energy technologies. So that's the long way of saying, I do think that she would continue to provide financial support for clean energy technologies, but she will also, I believe, given the dynamics I just laid out, provide support for the oil and gas industry as well. And that is very different than 4 years ago and 8 years ago, where Democrats were all in on the new Green Deal and all in on, clean energy in many ways only. That's changed.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think a big part of America's economic story and its continued growth has been cheap energy. And you can see that in the UK, there has not been an all of the above strategy. It's been nuclear plus renewables. That's kind of the direction that we're moving in. And that's leading to pretty high energy costs, whereas the North Sea oil and gas industry is now really under quite a lot of pressure and under even more pressure given the changes that this government has made. So I think that's a big challenge for the competitiveness of the UK and Europe more widely, that the US just has this huge energy abundance that it is exploiting, and that option isn't necessarily open to a number of European countries. But equally, we don't have, I suppose, or we're unwilling to fire the big fiscal bazooka that the US fired in the Inflation Reduction Act. So, you traditionally you would think of the United States as not a country that goes for industrial strategy. But suddenly, I mean, that's a huge change, Liz. The US has gone for one of the biggest expressions, in fact, probably the largest expression of industrial strategy since the war, actually, and that has really impacted capital flows, as the question says. So, in a world where that option isn't available to the UK, what else can you do to try and incentivize that investment? And I think that's what this government, the Labour government, is trying to work on.
We've got time for one last question, and I think this question nicely wrap up some of the key things that we have been discussing today, and hopefully also allow us to take something back as we counsel our clients. So the question is, any practical lessons from 2024 that we should learn as experts in establishing dialogue between the corporate and government sectors? So I think that's the first part of the question. Second part of the question asks, does the culture of communication between governments and businesses change while political tension and division grows? Do you see any complications or new opportunities?
Yeah, I'll take the first part. I think the practical lesson here is getting to know government, speaking the government's language, understanding the process, knowing the players. That is not just an election year activity set. That's something that companies, and particularly multinational companies that need to do this region by region, something they have to be constantly doing because change happens very quickly. I mean, John pointed out France, right? Who knew we were going to have French elections, right? That the political process, it takes a very long time for policies to be implemented, but political change can happen very, very quickly. So it's important to take away that this focus on policy, politics in the intersection between government and corporations, it's not an election year activity. This is something that should be 24/7 for companies. So if we start there, the other thing I'd say is that to kind of tie this all up, don't pick sides. This is exactly what I was mentioning earlier. We're getting to know all the players on all sides, even if there's a party in power now. Don't pick sides publicly or in terms of how you create the relationships you need in order to advance your business objective. And then the final thing is don't lose sight of your business objective. It's easy to focus so much of the politics and policy that you forget why you're doing these things.
Yeah, I completely agree. I would say the takeaway is to think carefully about when and what you talk to government about. I think there's been a well-intentioned move into certain areas of almost political activism by corporates over the last 4 or 5 years. Yeah, as I say, often very well motivated. But when you go into the world of politics with a capital P, you then get dragged into all sorts of things. And that's a very difficult and uncomfortable place for companies to be. So I think you need to think about when it is you speak, what you speak about, and to be, as Liz says, be focused on your business primarily and all the other things afterwards.
And there we have it. I hope this session has been insightful for those who took precious time to join us today. Thank you, everyone. And if you have any further questions after this webinar, you know who to look for, Liz, John. Feel free to reach out to them if you've got any additional questions that we did not get to answer in this webinar. And I'm sure we'll all be watching the results of the US elections in 4 weeks' time, and perhaps we can even revisit this topic when the dust has settled. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.